hopefully you're going to walk away with a few more questions and a few more thoughts than maybe what you came with today. So the title is really tissue sampling for peak performance, but I really want to change the focus a little bit to more of a journey. So if you look there in the corner, you see this mountain. And as you think about your journey to higher yields, it is truly that. It is a journey. There's different plateaus or different struggles. You think you reach a level of a yield level, and next year you drop back, and then you try to climb again. It's just a huge climb. So what we're doing here is really trying to help you climb as well. How do we climb together through this high yield challenge? Well, let's see if we get the... So this is an example I want to show you. So this is Dave Hula. We all know Dave in his journey. What I found interesting was his climb to high yields. If you're just starting the climb to high yields, you have to understand it's a process. It takes time. It takes a lot of challenges. It takes a lot of learning and exploring. If you look through this, about every 4 years, it took Dave about 4 years to bust through the next yield plateau. So he's been at this a while. So if you're at a plateau of a 250 bushel, thinking that you're going to go to 500 in a matter of 1 year is probably not realistic. How do we be more realistic? How do we do this journey together? So I want to share with you today kind of the journey that AgriGold has taken in 2019 to try to climb a little bit higher. Well, the first thing that we looked at was looking at applying a micronutrient mix about 350 GDU. What did that do? We also looked at the late season grain fill. I think you're going to find some fascinating things with this as well that correlates very well with our tissue sampling. We're going to look at our tissue sampling continued, 4 years of data. How's that changed? What do we continue to learn there? And then finally, I want to share with you just a little bit of a project that one of our agronomists did with boron. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So if you listen to some of the yield masters, some of the growers who are growing high yields, one of the things that they talk about is tricking that corn plant with micronutrient pack about 350 GDUs. They want to trick that plant to put a bigger ear on. Well, whenever you hear these little things of this nature, at least from an agronomy standpoint, you get pretty intrigued. Is that true? Is that realistic? Can we duplicate that out in the field? Well, the agronomy team took that to task, and this year, even with all the weather problems we had, we were able to put out some trials where we sprayed a micro pack at 350 GDUs. Well, whenever you do a trial, you never know what you're going to get. And then we started looking at the data. And the data was pretty fascinating because when I first looked at it, I saw the data and it said there was a 50% win rate and about a 0 bushel advantage. Well, that is extremely disheartening, right? You as growers have experienced that same thing, right? You put all this time and effort into it and you get nothing in return. Well, then we started breaking it out, and I think the story back here is a pretty big story. If you look at our trials that were less than 200 bushel, we virtually saw a no yield advantage. On here it says a -12. I would just simply say not a yield advantage. You get to 200 to 225 and it was about a break even, a 50-50. But you get above 225, 230, 240, you see a different story there involved as well. You see the win rate go to 70%. Well, in the world of ag, 70% is like 100% everywhere else. You just don't get 100% win rate on anything. It just doesn't happen. But a 70% is pretty high. And then you see a 12 bushel advantage. Well, what do we do with this? What does this tell us? Well, I think this once again reaffirms some things. It reaffirms that if you are at a less than a 230, 240 bushel average, micronutrients and a lot of these other gadgets probably are not your limiting factor. Your limiting factor is probably something bigger, whether it be potassium, phosphorus, whether it be drainage, whether it be lime, whether it be something else. Something else is our limiting factor there. So chances are, if you try a lot of these micronutrients, you try a lot of these biologicals, you try all these sugars, chances are you're not going to see much of yield advantage at that lower yield environment. You need to get rid of that bigger limiting yield factor to maybe try to climb until you get to above 230, 240, then you can begin doing some of these other fun little projects So you get a little bit better ROI. So then we start looking at some tissue sampling. What do we do this year with that? And I think it's very important to understand that the nutrient levels, there's a direct correlation to yield. And as we look through here, we'll see that. So one of the things we said last year at Commodity Classic, and we talked through, that the importance of nutrient levels at 2,400 GDUs. Now, roughly, what's the corn plant doing at 2,400 GDUs? Well, that's probably that dent stage or half milk line standpoint. How many of you concerned about the nutrient level at corn at that point? Well, most of us, to be honest, probably aren't real concerned because there's not a lot we can do, right? What's interesting is we had a particular grower. So this would be the this slide from last year that showed 2,400 GDUs, the nutrient level. So what you're looking at there is the blue line is 160 bushel environment, all the way up to the dark green line, that's 300 bushel environment. And consistently, the higher the nutrient level, the higher the yield level. Tells us that's a pretty important story. Well, we had a particular grower in Illinois who didn't believe this at all. He didn't believe that late grain fill was important. He thought that the old adage that hits dent, one more rainfall, my yield's made, I'm good to go. Well, one of the agronomists said, no, I don't believe that's right. I think there's more to the story. So what he did is he went out, get this to work here. He went out to do a little demonstration. So he went out to this grower's field and he pulled several ears off at about 3/4 milk line. And he took it back in the shop and put it in the shop and there just let it dry down naturally just to simulate what would happen if that plant died essentially at 3/4 milk line when he said his yield was made. Then he went back out at about 26%, that same field, and pulled ears. And then he started measuring, picturing and measuring. The suspense is killing me too. There we go. And this is what he found. Can you visually see a difference? So the A would be the one that was pulled at 3/4 milk line, and B was pulled at 26% moisture. And what he found after all those measurements, try to find that magical spot there, is a 25% grain increase by letting it fully grow and fully mature. So if you listen today to Randy and to David Hula, they talked about keeping that plant green all the way to the end. Who would have thought that a 25% yield increase can still be gained at 3/4 milk line? The importance of late season grain fill. Are we maximizing that? Are you trying to get to that next level? And if you're not maximizing that late season grain fill, this might be an area to start looking at it, because 25% on a 200 bushel crop is a lot of bushels. Very, very fascinating. So the tissue sampling project, this is year number 4. We have approximately 2,280 data points when it comes to this. And what's neat about this is each one of those data points is correlated to a GDU and to a final yield. So it's a little bit different, a little bit more robust sampling than what maybe you get somewhere else. So what we've been able to do is make some pretty strong correlations. So I just want to go through a few nutrients, just a few things that we've picked up out of this. We are by no means experts. We're learning just like you guys are. We don't have all the answers. But the first one, anybody that wants to raise more corn, the first thing they're going to run to is nitrogen. We need more nitrogen. We need to up the rates. Well, if you look through here, at the bottom is our growing degree units, and on the side is just the percent of plant. Now, some of it will be parts per million, just depending on the nutrient, just to give you some reference point. And then we start by yield level. So the blue lines on this side would be 160 all the way to 300. And the goal here is just to get the general trend. The general trend. So what this general trend tells me is, from a nitrogen standpoint, from about planting until tasseling, really not a big issue. Maybe even the lower yielding environments have too much nitrogen early, Maybe we're over applying nitrogen early, but what really starts to separate the story is after tasseling. So after about 1,450 GDUs, that'd be your grain fill period. And you continue to notice the higher the yield, the more nitrogen there. So if you are in a nitrogen program and most of that's up front, maybe we need to start thinking about ways of getting that to that corn plant a little bit later. More and more hybrids need that later in to fill that grain. 25%, remember, 25% yield advantage from 3/4 milk line takes nutrients to do that. And nitrogen is one of those. The other neat thing is we continue to hear more and more and more about sulfur, right? Sulfur this, what's the magical number with sulfur? What do we need to do? So kind of keep in your mind what this nitrogen graph looks like. Well, here's the sulfur one as well. What's fascinating is when you take the nitrogen at 300 bushel, we'll just throw that on top here. So what I essentially did was I took the nitrogen and put a dot on the 300 bushel, then I just transposed it here on the sulfur. Can you see a trend? Well, I hope you do. So there is definitely a direct correlation to a corn plant's use of nitrogen and sulfur. So as we go back, the ratio, you always people talk about what's the ideal ratio for nitrogen to sulfur. Well, the neat thing about what we've seen on these tissue samples is that the 300 bushel level, it's from early season, from planting to tasseling is about 15 to 1. And then from tasseling to grain fill is about 12 to 1. So a 12 to 1 ratio is probably pretty close to the ideal ratio from what we've seen so far on 300 bushel corn nitrogen to sulfur. So if sulfur is not an integral part of your program, you may want to start thinking about how you can get a 12 to 1 ratio to check this box and then put a hole in that bucket on sulfur. Okay, the crazy one, boron. The boron story with this graph is the boron story of life. Rhyme and reason is hard. Has anyone ever tried to conquer the world of boron? Try to move the needle on boron in your corn plant? Everyone talks about the importance of boron. It is an elusive nutrient. How do you get it in there? How do you keep it in there? And how do you make it make yield? Well, one of our agronomists said, let's take that under consideration. Let's try this project. How do we increase boron? So this particular agronomist doesn't do anything partial. He goes all in. So he took a location in Champaign, Illinois, actually our research station, and he went out to try to prove or try to figure out how to get the needle to move on boron. So he went out and he wide dropped this thing 6 times. Okay, 6 times, that's a lot. But each time he put it on, he put on 30 pound of N, 4 pound of sulfur, now this is a kicker, 1 pound of boron, salt, copper, and iron. All right, does anybody know approximately, if you're doing liquid boron at a 10% blend, how much 1 pound is? I heard it out there, it's about a gallon. Does anybody approximately know what a gallon of boron costs? Let's just say roughly $30. Okay, so there's a lot of money wrapped up here. But the whole point of this was we got to figure out, is there a point that we can begin to move that needle? Can we keep that level of boron elevated? So if you go out today or this summer when you got your corn growing and you just take a random sample from boron, you're going to find an average of 5 to 10 parts per million on boron. That's pretty standard across the board, about anywhere you go. We want to see that level at 25 or higher. That's kind of what we think we need it to be at. That's a huge jump, right? A huge jump. So let's see what happened with the results. So here's what we look at here. So there's several things to look at. Really, we're looking at the dark green line. That is the 6 applications of wide dropping versus the untreated. Hopefully from even all the way back, you can see a general trend there, right? We were able to move the needle with boron, and we were able to really maintain that pretty well throughout the growing season with multiple applications of a gallon of boron. Now, I don't think it's going to take 6 gallons of boron, but the whole mindset here is Well, if I go out and I put on a pint or a quart of boron, am I accomplishing anything? And from our results from this study and other things we have done, my answer would be no. You really don't. You've got to have pounds and pounds of boron in order to move the needle. And it's got to be a multiple application standpoint to really do anything. So unfortunately, a grower come up to me and say, hey, I put a quart of boron on my fungicide. Do you think I did anything? And you try to be kind and you try to be nice. But the reality is that grower probably should have taken all that money they spent on boron and taken their wife out to dinner, and the whole lot more would have been accomplished. It's kind of disappointing and discouraging, but a corn plant takes pounds of nutrients, and you need to keep that in mind. So the other part about this is the ultimate question. You ask, what was the yield advantage? Well, here's an example of what that plot yielded. So the untreated yielded about 162, and the 6 times application yielded 187. Now, you guys are all smart math people, about 23 bushel. I just spent 6 applications of boron. That's about $180. Math doesn't work, right, at all. Well, I will contend that if you're striving for higher yields, you have to have a little different mindset. And that mindset is not a direct relation. I spent this much money, I should get this much return. It's more of, can I build potential in my crop? Right? So we don't want to do this on big acres. We're doing this on small acres, small test plots, trying to see if we can build potential. So look at these ears. Can you see a difference between the 2 ears? Hopefully you can. On the untreated, you're going to notice a lot of tip. You're going to notice a lot of small kernels there at the end of the tip, and maybe they're not quite as girthy. Whereas the 187 bushel corn, filled out pretty much to the end, has a real nice kernel depth all the way to the end, and has a lot more girth. Now, they were extremely dry in Champaign, Illinois through most of the end of the grain fill period, so I don't think the potential was reached. But I say we definitely check the mark on, did we increase the potential of this crop? I do believe we did. Another rainfall, we could have seen something pretty more dramatic there as well. So if you're thinking about moving the needle with micronutrients, pints, quarts are not going to work. You've got to think about multiple quarts, multiple gallons, multiple applications. Potassium. Potassium is my new friend. If I can figure out how to do the potassium, I'd have to get a new day job. Potassium is a very hard nutrient to figure out and to master. So if you look here at the graph, there's a pretty general trend that higher potassium levels mean higher yield levels. So when we look at this graph, the agronomy department actually sat down with a professor from Purdue to discuss potassium. And this particular professor is passionate about potassium. She's a fantastic lady. We spent a lot of time with her. But the first thing out of her mouth was, potassium has 0 direct effect on yield. You want to talk about deflating a bunch of agronomists from the very beginning. So we threw this slide up at her. I said, okay, well, if it has no effect on yield, explain this. Well, she couldn't really explain it, but she stuck to her guns and said it does not have any direct yield or effect on yield. So we talked a little bit more, and we found some pretty fascinating things about potassium as you think about them. The other thing that she told us was that 90% of the things that potassium does can be substituted by something else. She had a great way of deflating all of her excitement about potassium. She says sodium is a pretty big, can also do the same thing that the potassium can do in a corn plant, can substitute it out as well. But she also told us that the newer hybrids, as she tests these things, use about 2 times more potassium than what older hybrids did. So if you think about your fertility program on potassium, has it doubled in the past 10 years of what you did before? Or are you applying the same amount of potassium you did 10 years ago? If you are, chances are you're not going to meet that hybrid's need. Trying to drive more potassium in that plant. What's interesting is she said that roots do not recognize potassium in a band. Didn't know that. So if you think about when you ban something, mainly nitrogen and phosphorus, if you ban that and then you start digging in that band, what you find is roots hit those bands and just proliferate. They grow, they get very profuse, a lot of root hairs. But if you do a band of potassium, it grows right through it as if it was never there. So if you are banding potassium, one of the things to think about is adding a little bit of nitrogen or a little bit of phosphorus to that band to get those roots to stop, to grow, and to suck in more of that potassium. But a straight potassium band is not going to be very beneficial to that plant at all. But what's important that we finally did get out of her, and what we finally determined, we believe that that last graph showed high potassium levels, meaning higher yields. Two main things, two take-home things that I come up with potassium. The first one is potassium helps you build a bigger factory. Can you raise 300, 400, 500 bushel potential on a 150 bushel plant structure? No, you can't. You got to have a bigger factory. You got to have bigger stalks, bigger leaves, bigger plant in order to produce that. And potassium does that. Potassium helps the cell growth. It helps make the plant bigger and healthier. Actually, if you're in a field where you're taking tissue samples and you happen to find several plants or a row or a section where the plants are taller and greener and healthier, if you take samples off those versus the plants that are smaller, runnier, your potassium probably is even higher on those green, healthy plants because you're building a bigger factory. The other thing that she said that it did, and it makes a whole lot of sense, is it's kind of the poor man's irrigation, right? Potassium helps water movement and water use efficiency. So these higher yields have to be a better manager of water. You have to use the water you have better, and potassium helps us do that. So while it doesn't have a direct effect on yield, it definitely has an indirect effect, and it's very important. So if you go back to the graph, if you're thinking about potassium, big take-home point with potassium is if you don't have your potassium levels maximized by 1,000 GDUs, 750 GDUs, the ball game is over. You cannot build potassium once you reach about 750 to 1,000 GDUs. So that's corn about this tall. So if you go in late with a potassium application, really all you're doing is fertilizing for the next crop. So potassium is a lot like nitrogen. You got to plant early. You got to plan how you get that in that plant, drive it in that plant early, because that's when it's used most regularly. All right, the last one that I've got here. A nutrient that we don't talk about much at all when it comes to corn or even soybeans. We talk a lot about N, P, K, zinc. We talk about boron. But the one that we don't talk much about is calcium. When was the last time you applied a calcium source other than lime to your crop? Most of us probably never have. But using this chart, this is a molar chart here, and really what it is, it talks about plant nutrient interactions. Well, if there's a product at the very top or a nutrient at the very top, that screams to me that maybe it might be kind of important. So what I did, I just circled all the nutrients that calcium interacts with. Quite a few, right? Pretty important. It's kind of the, I've heard it described as being the trucker of all nutrients. Calcium is extremely important. But if you listen to a lot of people, they'll tell you you have plenty of calcium in your soil, you don't need to worry about it. Well, has anybody ever seen a corn plant calcium deficient? I never have. I don't know if I can even identify what a calcium deficient plant is. But once again, as we're trying to go to the next yield level, deficiencies aren't what we're striving for. You know, we're striving to have the right concentration in a plant. So what's interesting about this is a tissue sampling graph on calcium. It once again screams that at the higher yield levels, there's something with calcium involved there. The lower yield levels tend to have not as much calcium in the plant as those higher yielding environments. So as we look about limiting factors, we always look at N, P, K, but maybe in some scenarios, a simple calcium problem may be there as well. But how do you know, right? How do you know? Well, that's a tough one. Well, this goes right into our last slide here for today. AgriGold is excited about this tissue sampling project. We're excited to do it with you growers. You guys are the ones that are helping us do all this information. We say thank you. We're ready to take this to a new era, a new segment of growers. To this point, we were just trying our best to build a platform. We just wanted to build a database to start from, a database we could share and to grow and to learn. Well, we have a pretty solid base. Now we want to help you, and we want to see if we can't go to that next level. What does it mean to have a 400 bushel tissue sample, a 350 bushel tissue sample? Well, we don't know. We don't have a very big database on that. So we're wanting to partner up. We're wanting to partner up with people we call our yield masters. And these are growers who are interested in learning, who are interested in changing, who are interested in sharing with us some information, as we can share information back and forth is what we're looking for. So we're looking for partners. And what this looks like is we are willing to help cover the cost of the tissue samples. We'll provide you supplies. We'll even give you instructions. We'll give you guidance. We'll even be more than happy to walk you through as much as we can. And what we ask in return is that you just simply pull the soil samples on your higher performing yields, and you share that with us. At the end of the year, we'll compare what you found to what we found and see if we can't grow that pattern together. It's really neat because once you have 2 or 3 years of tissue samples behind you, you can begin to tell the story. You can understand your limiting factors in your farm. You can start building a plan on how you can improve systematically, not just kind of guessing in the dark. So if you're all interested in learning more or wanting to figure out how all this fits into your program, please stop by and ask one of us in the black and white shirt. We'd love to help you as we go through here. So that's what I have for today. I thank you for your time and your attention. Please enjoy the rest of the Commodity Classic. I'll be here the rest of the afternoon if you got any questions.